Dr. Jamal Wakim, thank you very much for accepting my invitation again. It's always a pleasure to discuss different geopolitical issues with you, especially regarding Syria. As you may know, I posted a video a few days ago about the US-backed federalism project in Syria, which the United States is trying to promote to the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, which is mainly a Kurdish militia in addition to some other ethnicities. So the United States is saying that their pressure on Syria could be minimized if Syria accepts certain reforms. One of it is federalization. So the first question is, if we want to shed light or to explain, to elaborate our audience about federalism, what's the definition of federalism and how a federal system would look like in Syria? Is it based on ethnic, religious, or sectarian basis?
Okay, first of all, let's discuss the federal system as a political system. It's it's never based on ethnicity. So if we take, for example, the United States of America, which is a federal system, we don't see that it's based on ethnicity, on race, or on religion. So we don't have a state which is exclusive for blacks, another state which is exclusive for Catholics, so on and so forth. It's an administrative form of governing of a wide area. It gets costly on a narrow area. So when talking about the United States of America, it's a huge country that should be governed with giving certain, let's say, autonomy for states in order to better manage a wide area. Whereas in the case of Syria, which is 180,000 square kilometers, it's still a narrow area. And a federal system would engender a bigger, let's say, administration, which becomes costly for good governance. So that's why I don't believe that federal system as an administrative system would fit into the case of Syria. That's from a pure theoretical perspective. In addition, the federal system is, for example, we see that federal system is imposed in huge countries like the United States of America, Canada, Russia, and Germany, for example. It's a federal system. Okay, but in all cases, we don't see that these systems are ethnic based. Okay, so the states in the United States are not ethnic based, nor religious based. The same applies to Russia, for example, the Russian Federation. The same applies to Germany or to Canada. There is another thing. In the case of these four countries, which are a role model for a federal system, there was we need to see the historic process. Okay, so the United States was a state in let's say which was increasing in space. It was expanding. Okay, so it was the venture of particular groups that went on for quote unquote discovery of land, taking over land, and then applying for joining the Union. So it was moving from the particular identity into the wider and more, let's say, inclusive identity, which is the national identity. So in the case of Russia, for example, we see that Russia was expanding on a steady expansion since the 16th century onward. So with expansion, when territories were added to Mother Russia, federalism served to move from more particular, let's say, regional identities, trying to integrate them into a wider national identity. Same applies to Germany, which got unified only 160 years ago. Okay. Same applies to Canada, which was trying to create a common identity for all Canadians by playing on the wider national identity at the expense of particular identities or regional identities. So in each and every country, there is always the regional, the particular identity for each and every group, for each village, for example, even if they are of the same ethnicity, okay? And then we have the wider, the national identity, which is common for all citizens, okay? In the case of Syria, it doesn't apply. Syria is not a country in expansion. Actually, Syria, when the modern Syria revolved around two cities, the Damascus and Aleppo, and all other regions were dependent on these two cities for thousands of years. So when calling for a federal system in a particular region, this means that we are damaging what is all-inclusive, the national, to favor or to let's say, to promote particular identities at the expense of the national identity. And this is not only particular to Syria, but it applies to all other regions.
Like in Lebanon, for example.
Lebanon or any other state. In addition, any, let's say, a feature or any, whether it being nationalism, ethnicity, religion, etc., we need to see in what context it operates. So if we talk about Arab nationalism, there are versions of Arabism. There is the more rigid, more, let's say, there are fanatic versions, but there are also more liberal or more open versions of Arab nationalism. So the nationalism of Nasser is totally different from the nationalism promoted in the early, late 19th century and early 20th century. Whereas that the earlier form of nationalism served the bourgeois class in the Arab East, the Arab nationalism of Nasser was a mere platform for national liberation and anti-imperialism. So in the case of the of federalism in Syria, in what context some groups are trying to promote it? It's in the context of dividing the region and redrawing the geopolitical map of the region. To what is the objective, the geopolitical objective of the United States? It's to, let's say, first divide Syria, damage national identity as a geopolitical tool in countering imperialist plans in the region, to the favor of promoting ethnicities, ethnic entities that would fit the interests of the geopolitical interests of Israel. Because in this case, Israel, which is surrounded by a majority of Arabs, Muslims, etc., would be, and the base of modern Arab nationalism is Syria since the 19th century. So instead of having, let's say, a majority of Arabs and Muslims, okay, which were never hostile to minorities, and I will say how, okay? The evidence is that minorities, or let's say other religious groups and ethnicities, have lived with among Arabs and with Arabs, and were given, let's say, special place in the Arab Islamic history, okay, which is the banner actually that includes Christians, Muslims, Kurds, Arabs, Persians, Turks, Armenians, etc., throughout the 1400 years of Islamic preeminence in the region. So replace this with, instead of having this majority, we will have a Druze state, a Christian state, a Sunni state, a Alawi state, whatever. And in this case, we will replace this majority with a mosaic of minorities. And in this case, Israel will become the biggest minority in a mosaic of minorities, and all other groups will have to seek, let's say, the leadership of Israel in the region. Whereas by nationalism, which is, we have to discuss this in a special episode, with all its flaws, Arab nationalism, with all the flaws that were promoted by certain regimes, would serve as an integrative platform, especially if we know that minority groups have played a major role in Arab nationalism. So the major figures of Arab nationalism were either originally Turkmen, Kurds, Christians, non-Muslims, for example. So, like the case of Ali Bouzou, who was a minister of Syria in the early 1950s. Ali Bouzou was a Kurd, but a fierce Arab nationalist. Another figure, they say, for example, Shukri al-Quwatli, the former president of Syria,
True.
who was, let's say, whose nickname was the first Arab citizen after union with Egypt in 1958. He was, he earned the nickname or the title, the first Arab citizen in the Arab world. For example, we see, by the way, the first Arab to rule Syria is Hafiz Assad. All other presidents before him were either of Turkmen or Kurdish origins. So there was never a discrimination against Kurds or Turkmens or other groups. The first, by the way, the Kurds of Syria, they came from Turkey, from Eastern Anatolia. The first wave of immigrants came after the first persecution by when they rebelled against Ataturk in 1925. They were hosted in Syria and they worked in the land. The first time they were granted nationality in Syria, it was in 1960 by Nasser, the main figure of Arab nationalism. Why? Because of socialist reforms. So in this case, the Kurds who came as immigrants, or let's say as refugees to northeastern Syria, they were granted citizenship in order to, as part of the socialist reforms in Syria, and they were granted piece of land there, okay? So in this case, nationalism or Arab nationalism was never repulsive against them. Let's not take the case of Iraq with Saddam Hussein, because it's a particular one and it needs special discussion. Let's focus on Syria. So that's the second point. The third point is that let's say, what Qassad is trying to promote in northeastern Syria is very similar to what the Phalange Party tried to promote in Lebanon, a particular entity for Christians in Lebanon. But what was the result for the Christians in Lebanon? The result was not only a massacre, not by Muslims, by the way, but it was a massacre by the Christians themselves, of other Christians, non-abiding Christians, okay? And the end result was a mass exodus because of the dire situation and because the Christian ghetto during the civil war couldn't live by itself. So there were no economic opportunities. Millions, let's say hundreds of thousands, and even estimates say that 1 million Christian left Lebanon by the early 1990s, not because of, let's say, Muslim hostility in as much as because of the impossible viability of this entity, economically speaking. So in the case of the Kurds, they are falling, or mainly Qassad, they are making
Qassad are the
Kurds,
SDF for the audience to know.
Yes, they are acting like the Phalange Party acted during the civil war in Lebanon. They are working on behalf of an American project in the region, and they are driving the Kurds into, I believe, a similar fate. Why is that? First, because the Kurds in northeastern Syria, the SDF claimed that this is for the respect of plurality. But if this was the case, why the Assyrians, other minority Christian, the Syriacs and other minority Christian groups were persecuted by SDF, and why they had to flee their homeland, historical homeland, since thousands of years? That's one thing. Another thing is that the Kurds in that region are not a majority. The majority are Arab tribes who are affiliated with kinship with the Arab tribes of Western Iraq and of Arab tribes of Northern Saudi Arabia. In the case of a conflict, now the Americans are there and are protecting, let's say, or shedding their umbrella on the region. But throughout history, we know that nobody can count on the Anglo-Saxons, whether being British or Americans, because the Kurds themselves were promised at many instances a nation state or a national state, but they were backstabbed by the Anglo-Saxons at several occasions, whether in the 1920s when they were sold off to Ataturk and they were slaughtered, or in the 1950s, or later on in the 1970s and 80s. So first, in case they follow, or in case SDF keeps on going on their track, and for the service of the American agenda, at one point the Americans will have to withdraw because they are fighting a lost battle there.
True.
Okay. In this case, the SDF will put the whole Kurds of the region at odds with Arab tribes, in spite of the fact that they have lived for decades, among Arabs in a region that was predominantly either Arab or Syriac or Assyrian or let's say non-Kurd. Okay, so in this case, what would be the end result of this conflict? Okay, that's one thing. Another thing is that the American project or geopolitical project in the region is doomed to fail, because the Americans are trying to control the region in order to contain Eurasia. But for the first time since 5 centuries, we are witnessing a retreat of Western influence. And America is facing a deep crisis, a structural crisis in the United States, whether economically or politically. And it was best featured by the crisis engendered by the Trump-Biden competition, electoral competition. So this crisis is due to the fact that for the first time in 5 centuries, the West is losing the edge. Eurasia is rising. And Eurasia needs access to the East Mediterranean. And this access would only be secured through northern Syria and eastern Anatolia. So no way for the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians to accept a state that would, let's say, be established in northern Syria, eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, and northwestern Iran, that would serve as an obstacle for the access of Eurasia towards the East Mediterranean. Okay? If we go back in history into the 14th century, long before the Kurds, there was an Armenian state, an Armenian kingdom in northern Syria, in southern Turkey now, which is in Little Armenia. It's called Little Armenia. Okay, and it was the ally of the Achaemenids. Oh, sorry, of the Ilkhanate. Okay, it prospered then. Why it prospered? Because there was a need by the Eurasian power, the Mongols of the time, to have access to the East Mediterranean. Okay, so there is no question for Eurasia to accept a hostile state rising to prominence in this very important region that would prevent it from having access to the East Mediterranean. What would be the alternative? I believe that what we need in the region is not only pluralism, and first, I'm not for ethnic pluralism. I'm for citizenship, the individual and his direct relationship to the state, whether being Arab, Armenian, Kurd, of any Christian, Muslim, etc. So one individual, one vote, and direct belonging to the state without, let's say, partial identities that would block him from being a full-fledged citizen. And in this region, we have lived together for thousands of years. Okay, the first time we witnessed genocide was, and ethnic and confessional massacres, it was with Western infiltration in the region. So we cannot ever count, even the Ottoman state, by the way, it was still a pluralist state until the first infiltration by Western powers into the region by the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. And this resulted with the first massacre of the Greek Orthodox in the 1820s in Istanbul. Okay, so we need to learn from our lesson. Okay, we have lived together in the region, and it was only with Western infiltration in this region that we started to see massacres, ethnic, confessional, religious conflicts, and it's only by sticking together that we can rebuild this multi or pluralist society, as it was the case for 1400 years.
Dr.
And even before.
Dr. Jamal, to be honest, I prepared 5 questions for you, and you already answered to the 5 questions and more during this short period of time. And
okay, now we can have a drink then.
Yes, and to be honest, me and you, we have different ethnicities, for example, but I totally agree with you on the citizenship and on the national identity and our relationship to the state and to the constitution. We need to be treated equally, all of us. I'm Armenian, for example. I'm Syrian of Armenian origins. And I would like also to send this message.
I'm Arab and Christian, for example.
Yes. So this is my message also to my Kurdish friends, that we lived in this region for centuries, regardless if they came from Turkey or Iraq or not. But we are now in the same geography together, especially in Syria. And I'm for the opinion that the federalism will eventually lead to partition of Syria. And this is playing in the hands of Israel, as you already mentioned, and the geopolitical interests of the United States. And I'm expecting more pressure from Russia in this regard, because Russia, until this moment, is trying to balance the powers in the eastern shores of the Euphrates, especially with the Kurds. But at the end of the day, the United States cannot bear or cannot continue occupying Syria for a longer period of time. Especially the former ambassador of United States to Syria also mentioned this idea, that what are the objectives of the United States? Why are we there? Okay, we are stealing $50 million per day from the revenues of the oil, but is that even a geopolitical goal? It's not. So they're financing themselves through the revenues of the oils, but they're not achieving underground, let's say, for the geopolitical goals in Syria. Therefore, sooner or later, they will withdraw from Syria, and the Kurds will find themselves, not all of them, of course, because in Aleppo and in Damascus, there are also Kurdish communities, and they're not calling for federalism, but most of the separatists are in the eastern shores of the Euphrates. They will find themselves in an island where the all surrounding is like hostile to them. So they're really working against their interests. Therefore, my message is like federalism is the fate of the federalism could be, like you already mentioned, of what happened with the Christians at the Phalanges in Lebanon. So if we speak objectively and if we think about it rationally, we all need to sit and maybe redraft our constitution if there are things that we need to change, and strengthen the national identity instead of calling for a partition or stealing the oil of Syria. Like 50% of the Syrian oil is on the eastern shores of the Euphrates. And I am for federalism in one condition: if it is between Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, for example, with the neighboring countries. I am for such federalism. Yes, in this case, if it's expanding, of course.
And federalism would be a first stage towards building or integrating all countries into one national identity that takes in consideration the Arab heritage, the Syriac heritage, the Kurdish heritage, the Armenian heritage, the Turkmen heritage, which are all part of the identity of the region. And this is what we need to admit.
Dr. Jamal Wakim, it was really interesting discussion with us. I would like to host you more often on Syriana analysis, and I would like also to hear.
Pleasure always.
I would like also to hear the opinion of my followers or the fans of Syriana analysis, guys. I would like to read your comments. I also received some questions in the previous video. I would like to answer to your questions again. I will make a videos and answer to your questions. And if you're new and you like the content of my channel, please hit the subscribe button. And you can become a patron of mine. You can find the link in the description below. It really helps me a lot because I'm independent. I would like to keep my independence and bring to you more information in the next videos.